Good morning YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. It's Sunday. Feisty, the little male swamp wallaby, is eating a piece of bread. And apparently ABC Radio is going to give us a bit of an insight into the possibility or the likelihood or the probability of the downing of MH-17 sparking a new Cold War. And I've been struck by the fact that the only two world leaders who seem to be getting any benefit out of the downing of MH17 is Benjamin Nyetanyahu, because it's focused an enormous amount of world attention away from the carnage the Zionists are perpetrating in Gaza. I think they've killed like 800 Palestinians and 750 of them are civilians, sort of thing. I think there are 30 odd Israelis who have died, and all but one of them have been soldiers. I don't think the homemade bottle rockets that the Palestinians are firing out of Gaza into Israel are actually achieving much, apart from annoying the Israelis. And really, like, to be honest, for Israel to think that it's justified to use modern air force, modern artillery, modern tanks, the complete gamut of techno-industrial death machinery on a bunch of ragtag rebels who are hiding under the ground and firing ineffective rockets, it's a little bit like somebody who has qualifications as a national champion boxer deciding that it is justified to use all that skill and all that strength on an angry infant school child, you know, like an 8-year-old who comes up and kicks him in the shins. Yes, the 8-year-old has attacked the national champion boxer, but that doesn't mean it's okay for the national champion boxer to punch the infant's head off its shoulders. And that's pretty much exactly what Israel's Zionistic-led government and military are doing in Gaza. You know, like, they are shelling beaches and killing children. They are shelling hospitals operated by the United Nations because somebody around the corner fired a gun at them. Anyway, let's get on to the imminent World War III, or Cold War II, leading to World War III, which is brewing in the Ukraine. The other world leader who's getting a great kudos out of it is my Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott has bluffed Putin into backing down. He sent Julie Bishop over to run around Kiev a couple of times. Apparently there's 190 Australian federal police officers, both armed and unarmed, as well as some Australian military personnel who are poised ready to invade the province of Ukrainistan, which I call Ukrainistan because it's just another one of the buffer ring of satellite states where the natives are revolting on the outside edge of the old Soviet Union, now called the Mother Russia Federation. Tony Abbott is apparently banking on the fact that Australia has had strong defences built up against the Russians since 1854, when Pinchgut Island in Sydney Harbour was fortified with cannons and a fortress known as Fort Denison. If the Russians decide to send a Black Sea fleet to attack Australia because Tony Abbott is annoying the shit out of Vladimir Putin, it's alright, we're going to hide behind Fort Denison, fellas. That's right. Feisty feels safe.
That's dramatically the cause of freedom and
This
peace.
is Ronald Reagan.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
Ronald Reagan beseeching Mikhail Gorbachev, and what would turn out to be the closing days of the Cold War, that defining tension, capitalism versus communism, of the post-World War II world. Are we slipping back into the old habit of that East-West divide? Russia, again, being painted as the territorial aggressor, an ambitious and powerful state whose intentions are not to be trusted. It's done many things, but the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, well, it's focused world attention on the conflict over East Ukraine, or more broadly on Russia's role in that conflict. What are its ambitions in Europe or even beyond? What are we to make of Vladimir Putin, a politician who seems to play by a different set of rules? Certainly one driven by his own distinct set of political priorities. Is that Cold War, that Reagan moment, is that really dead and buried? Or are we opening a whole new chapter? To talk this over, Tom Switzer joins you. He's from the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Barbara Keys too. Barbara is a senior lecturer in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne. And Stefan Auer, he's Associate Professor in European Studies at the University of Hong Kong. Welcome to you all.
Good morning.
Tom, to begin with you, the characterisations and the stereotypes of the Cold War die pretty hard. Here's from this week, ANU's Paul Dibb writing in The Australian. He says this: true to form, President Putin is resorting to lying about Russia's involvement in the tragic shooting down of Malaysian Airlines flight MH-17. This is a classical KGB colonel's deception disguising his true intent. It's the language we're pretty familiar with, Tom. Are we right to draw those comparisons with the mid-20th century?
Well, I have great respect for Paul, and I think he is reflecting the conventional wisdom, not just in Canberra, but in Washington and in London and many parts of Western Europe, that the standoff between Russia and Ukraine is blamed entirely on Russian aggression and Putin's goal to somehow recreate the former Soviet empire. You know, the bear's on the prowl and we must put it back in its cage. This is the narrative now in the West. But I think it's more complicated. First of all, I have to make it quite clear that, you know, people all around the world are understandably angry about the failure of the rebels, the Russian-backed rebels in eastern Ukraine, to respond satisfactorily to this tragedy. But at the same time, I think that the US and the European Union are hardly blameless in this crisis. My argument is different from Paul Dibb's. It's that the West's efforts to pull Ukraine from Russia's strategic orbit, that's always going to guarantee big trouble. And many Cold Warriors, including the intellectual architect of the Cold War doctrine of containment, George Kennan, made those very predictions in the mid to late 1990s against NATO expansion. He said it would ultimately provoke the bear needlessly, and that's what's happened.
Is that what's going on, Barbara? Is that settlement that saw the end of the Cold War, that sort of sense of almost agreed territory and boundary, has that been impinged by the West? Is that provoking Russia?
Well, that's certainly the way Putin and many Russians see it. Like China, Russia regards the United States as a malevolent power, really, in the world, one that likes to throw its weight around improperly. And there's a tremendous amount of resentment at the United States. There's a new poll in Russia, for example, that shows that public opinion about the United States is at one of its lowest points in recent memory. So there is a sense in which Russians think that what the United States is doing is interfering in their own backyard, in the Ukraine, and that's a legitimate interpretation given what has happened in Ukraine over the last few months.
So the Ukraine, Stefan, becomes tremendously significant in that new tension.
Can I just say I'm astounded by Tom Switzer's argumentation. I have a great respect for him as the editor of Spectator, but what he's saying about Russia is simply appalling. It's Russian apologist argument. When you started with Ronald Reagan, I had goosebumps because I come from communist Czechoslovakia, and the fact that communism collapsed in 1989, I am delighted about, and I am less concerned about whether this constitutes a new Cold War or not, but whether the West is able and capable to respond decisively to the threat of Russian expansionism, right? And that is where I admire Ronald Reagan, and I suspect that Tom Switzer would share my admiration. And the problem we have in the West right now is that we don't have anyone with similar credibility to stand up to Putin's Russia, because the threat is serious. I mean, even the way in which Tom Switzer talked about the shooting down of the aeroplane, he said that people in the West are angry with the way in which rebels dealt with the aftermath of the catastrophe. I mean, surely people are angry about the fact that the plane was shot down, and that there is little doubt now that it was shot down by the rebels, the terrorists, right, supplied by Russia and supported by Russia. So this is a lethal threat to the West. To replicate the argument that Putin is putting forward about the legitimate interest, it's simply appalling.
In what way, Stefan, should the West respond to that? The argument can be made, as Tom does, of some reasonable interest in eastern Ukraine. For the West to respond in any sort of stern way would escalate that tension and that conflict extraordinarily.
Tom's argument is fundamentally incoherent. If he is true to his conservatism, he values sovereignty as the guiding principle in international relations. May I remind our listeners that Ukraine was guaranteed sovereignty and inviolability of its territory in 1994 Budapest Memorandum in exchange for giving up on its nuclear weapons, signed by the US, by the UK, and Russia itself. That memorandum, of course, is now in tatters. So the West needs a much more robust response. I agree with Tom and everyone who argues that the situation is complicated, but it doesn't help to obfuscate the matters, and it doesn't help to support Putin's lies.
First of all, my aim here is not to defend anything Putin has done. It's simply to explain his response. He deems it, and many Russian people deem this a genuine threat to Russia's vital interests. And my point is that if we understand Putin's motivations, his conduct is easy to understand, which is not to say you have to like it. And I think you need to understand this crisis, the cause of the crisis, if you want any hope of trying to solve it. Ronald Reagan, like most American presidents in the aftermath of the end of World War II and the beginning of the Iron Curtain in the 1940s, were right to contain Soviet expansionism. It was a life-threatening moral, ideological and geopolitical threat to the West. But I think the circumstances and conditions of the post-Cold War have changed dramatically. Let's go back to this point about NATO expansion. That took place in the late 90s, early to mid-2000s, and by helping bring down a democratically elected, pro-Russian, yes, it was corrupt and thuggish, but it was democratically elected and a pro-Russian government in Kiev last February, I think that Putin was aggravated and intervened. The point is, this has repudiated all of what the West has done virtually since the end of the Cold War, at least since Clinton, has repudiated the implicit agreement between Bush Sr. and Gorbachev in the early 1990s that NATO, once a unified Germany was part of NATO, would not extend into Eastern Europe and the Baltics, because this was seen as a region that Russia had long viewed as a necessary zone of protection well before Stalin became prominent. And I think in doing that, the West has failed to take into account Russian susceptibilities and interests. We have to bear in mind, Ukraine is a huge mass of strategic importance to Russia. They've been subjected to invasions from Napoleonic France, Wilhelmite Germany, Nazi Germany. Why would any Russian leader tolerate a Cold War military pact to move in his nation's backyard? And why would he acquiesce in a Western-backed coup to replace an ally with an anti-Russian regime in Kiev? Geopolitics 101.
We're trying to unpick some European tensions here on Sunday Extra. Tom Switzer there, Barbara Keys and Stefan Auer also join you. Barbara, I mean, was Russia provoked in this? And is Russia's current truculence explicable in the sort of terms that Tom puts it there?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that Putin will not accept Ukraine that is part of the Western orbit and that might join NATO, even though that's certainly not in the cards in the near future. The most reasonable solution that people have suggested is one that allows a kind of Finland solution for Ukraine, one in which Ukraine is neither in the orbit of the West or in the orbit of Russia. And the former ambassador to Russia from the United States, Michael McFaul, has suggested that one way to get out of this crisis at the moment is for Putin to go to Ukraine's leader, Poroshenko, and say, look, here's what I need in order to declare victory in eastern Ukraine. I need this kind of autonomy. I need this kind of recognition of the status of the Russian language. And if you agree to these things, I can say that I've achieved my goals in eastern Ukraine, we can solve the problem. Now, I'm not sure that's likely because Putin has really backed himself into a corner with this. He's whipped up a nationalist frenzy at home, and to be seen as backing down would be a catastrophic blow for his popularity at home.
Stefan, can we take this slightly broader beyond East Ukraine? And there is a great commonality of interest at this moment between, for example, China and Russia. Are we seeing the potential for I don't want to use the expression Cold War, but I will, a new Cold War that's not between communist and capitalist, but it's between a powerful authoritarianism, between state capitalism and the free market?
That danger is very real, but that just reinforces my point of the importance of a seriously tough stance towards Russia. If I just may comment on what Tom Switzer said about the expansion of NATO. This is a myth that Russia has propagated. That myth has been comprehensively proven wrong by a prominent scholar of the Cold War, Mark Kramer, and I would recommend to Tom Switzer to study that piece. But more importantly, NATO is not an aggressive alliance. Russia is an aggressive force. I'm truly astounded that the conservative commentator can fall for the lies that Putin's Russia is spreading. This is what weakens the West. And I'm under no illusion that sanctions, for example, tougher sanctions, would solve all the problems. Of course, Putin's is a nationalist project, so tougher sanctions in the short term might even strengthen his popularity because he can blame all the problems that ordinary Russians have on the West.
But the point, isn't it, Tom, that provocation of Putin from the West only strengthens him internally?
Well, there's no question he's overwhelmingly popular, and his popularity has gone up since the military incursion in Crimea. But I would argue that his calculations so far are based on an old truth of geopolitics. And we're pretty naive if we think that just because the Cold War has ended, that Soviet communism has ended, that we all live in a world where national self-determination reigns supreme. That would be ideal. But great powers, since time immemorial, fight tooth and nail when vital strategic interests are at stake, and they doggedly guard what they refer to as a sphere of influence. Now, this is unfortunate. It's a shame for certainly the non-Russian people in Ukraine, but it's the way the world works. It always has. Stefan needs to ask himself, how would Washington would respond if Russia or China had signed up Cuba and Venezuela in a military pact and expanded an old Warsaw Pact security agreement to the Caribbean, or if it helped bring down a democratically elected pro-US government in Mexico? I think we know the answer to that. And I think it was inevitable that Moscow would push back somewhere. But just because it's acted in this way, I don't think amounts to the new Nazi Germany or a new Soviet empire. This is ultimately a defensive strategy on Putin's part.
Pushing back in broader ways too, Barbara. I mean, we saw that the creation of the BRICS group, the leaders of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, a new development bank announced this week to take on the sort of American-led global economic order. This is tougher, Barbara, than simply what's going on in East Ukraine. There are substantial global ambitions in this.
Yes, and I think what we might see as the rise of BRICS is pointing to another facet of what's happening now, and I think we may be seeing the beginning of the long decline of American hegemony. We've talked a lot about the rise of China, and I think we're entering into a transition period where we're seeing a far more multilateral system than we've seen before. BRICS is going to be strengthened by what's happening in Ukraine. Russia certainly has far more incentive now to strengthen ties with BRICS, which is in itself a very unwieldy conglomerate of countries with disparate interests, disparate values, and divergent economic views. But it is, because they have a common interest in uniting against Western hegemony, the latest move is a pushback against serious pushback against the Bretton Woods system, which makes the U.S. dollar the world's reserve currency and which gives the United States tremendous benefits derived from that. So that it is a real challenge.
A moment of great change, and one which, as we've seen in this discussion, stirs passions. Thanks to you all. It's fascinating. We've, as ever, barely scratched the surface. Tom Switzer from the United States Studies Centre, University of Sydney, Barbara Keys, joined you too, Senior Lecturer in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne, and Stefan Auer as well, Associate Professor in European Studies at the University of Hong Kong.
And there we will leave it. My impression is that Putin decided that he was not prepared to allow the West to meddle in the Ukraine government. Therefore, he armed the rebels. And he armed the rebels with everything that he thought the Ukrainian government would have. The only thing he didn't give them was aircraft. And he was probably prepared to lend Russian air power if things got tough. Trouble is, he gave them Sam 11s or Book surface-to-air missiles. And the rebels, there we go, runaway swamp wallaby. The rebels then accidentally shot down a civilian airliner. And when they accidentally shot down a civilian airliner, they've tried to cover it up, and Putin has tried to cover their ass. And now he looks like an idiot on the world stage. I'm not saying that Tony Abbott looks like anything other than a puppet of Obama by running around basically telling Putin what he must do in order for the world opinion to forgive him for his role in arming the rebels who accidentally shot down a civilian airliner and apparently delivered the death blow to the finances of Malaysian Airlines, because nobody can afford to lose 2 aeroplanes in 4 months. But anyway, that's the state of the art at the moment. 190 Australian Federal Police, both armed and unarmed, with some Australian military personnel mixed in, are champing at the bit to go in and secure the wreckage. Now I stress that it's not a crash site as such, because there was not an intact aircraft running into the flat round oblate object, right? What was happening was an aircraft was at 350 mile an hour, 33,000 feet, and the shrapnel from the missile that was presumably heat-seeking in its terminal guidance phase running up the back of the engines ruptured the fuselage. Maybe the explosion exceeded the stress tolerance limits of the wing spar and the engine mounting pods. The whole thing came to pieces in explosive decompression. And then the wreckage has fallen on about 9 or 15 square miles, depending on who you listen to. I think it's fairly ridiculous to expect to be able to recover the possessions of the people who were killed on the aircraft. I think even if it was not a country at war, such a large debris field would likely be picked over by scavengers and looters. In a war zone, it's guaranteed that there are going to be people moving through there who are not responsive to whatever government is making pronouncements as to who's allowed to go there, and if they find a mobile phone on the ground, they'll pick it up and try and use it. I've heard cases of people ringing the mobile phones of their dearly departed and having Eastern European voices answer the telephone. The idea that somebody's going to go into the middle of a war zone, keep both the warring factions plus their schismatic elements at bay, and then conduct a emu parade grid search looking for all of the things that have been lost by everyone on the aircraft, it's ridiculous. They've got the flight box recorders, the cockpit voice recorder and the data recorder. I'm pretty sure they've got satellite images and or radar tracks from the NATO observers and the US spooks keeping an eye on the whole area. I don't think there's any doubt at all whatsoever as to where the surface-to-air missile came from. I think the Russian media claiming that the rebels were legitimately under the impression they were attacking Putin's personal private transport, transparent nonsense. The idea that the Ukrainian government would have used a jet fighter with an air-to-air missile to shoot down a civilian airliner is patently ridiculous. I think everybody should take a deep breath and calm down and accept that it was situation normal, all fucked up. That's what happens when people try to resolve anything with weapons and force. And it'll be interesting to see how Fort Denison goes protecting Australia against the approaching invasion of Putin's Black Sea Fleet. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.